When life looks complete but feels unlived, from the outside your life makes sense. You have structure, you have stability, you have progress. There are no obvious gaps, no dramatic failures, no visible chaos. And yet, something feels untouched, not broken, not tragic, just strangely distant. You wake up and move through your routine with competence. You handle responsibilities, you answer messages, you make decisions. You are functioning, but you're not fully inside your life. There's a difference between living and maintaining, between experiencing and managing. Somewhere along the way, you became very good at building a life that looks complete, a life that checks the boxes, a life that makes sense on paper, a life that others might even admire. But late at night, when everything gets quiet, there's a subtle question you avoid. Why doesn't this feel like mine? You don't hate your life. That would be easier to fix. You just don't feel fully present in it. Moments pass quickly. Achievements land softly. Days blur together without depth. You keep moving forward, but you don't feel the movement. You've built something solid. So why does it feel slightly unreal? Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe that's what makes it harder to admit. Because when life looks complete, you don't feel allowed to say it feels unlived. You try to explain it to yourself in logical ways. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you need a vacation. Maybe this is just adulthood. But rest doesn't fix it. Even when you slow down, the feeling lingers. It's not burnout in the dramatic sense. You're not collapsing. You're not falling apart. You're just not fully there. You move through meaningful milestones without feeling deeply moved by them. You accomplish things without feeling changed by them. You reach moments that once felt important, and they land softly. Not empty, just muted. There's a difference between having a full calendar and having a full experience. You have plans, you have structure, you have goals, but presence feels thin. You sit in conversations while thinking about the next task. You finish tasks while thinking about the next milestone. You reach milestones while thinking about what's missing. It's subtle, but it accumulates. And over time, your life starts to feel like something you manage instead of something you inhabit. You don't feel lost. You feel slightly removed, like you're watching yourself succeed from a small distance. And that distance is hard to explain, because nothing is obviously wrong, which makes it even harder to admit that something feels incomplete. Even when everything looks complete, at some point, you became very good at building structure, building stability, building a version of your life that made sense. You told yourself that once things were organized, once things were secure, once things were together, you would finally feel inside it. But that moment never quite arrived. You improved your habits. You optimized your schedule. You became disciplined. You removed chaos. And in removing chaos, you also removed spontaneity. You replaced uncertainty with control, replaced emotion with efficiency. And efficiency feels productive, but it doesn't always feel alive. Somewhere along the way, you started measuring progress more than presence. Did I achieve enough today? Did I improve? Did I move forward? You rarely asked, did I feel anything deeply? Because feeling deeply can slow you down. And slowing down can feel dangerous when your identity is tied to momentum. You built a life that functions smoothly. Bills are paid. Deadlines are met. Conversations are handled. Nothing is falling apart. And yet, there's a quiet flatness underneath it all. Not sadness, not despair, just a lack of texture. Moments pass without imprint. Days pass without depth. You're present physically, but internally you're slightly ahead, already anticipating, already planning, already calculating the next step. When someone laughs, you smile. When someone shares something meaningful, you respond appropriately. But inside, it feels distant, like you're participating through glass. You remember a time when things felt vivid, when a conversation could shift your entire mood, when a small win felt electric, when time felt expansive instead of compressed. Now, everything feels efficient. Even your emotions feel managed. You don't spiral dramatically, you don't collapse. You regulate quickly, and regulation is healthy until it becomes suppression. There's a subtle difference. Regulation acknowledges emotion and lets it move through you. Suppression edits it before it even forms. And you've become skilled at editing. Editing your reactions, editing your desires, editing your dissatisfaction. You tell yourself you're being mature, that you don't need to be overly emotional, that you don't need intensity, that calm is better. But calm isn't the same as numb. And sometimes, What you call calm is actually disconnection. You've been so focused on building a life that works that you forgot to ask whether it feels lived. There's a difference between existing in a system and experiencing your own moments. Existing is efficient. Experiencing is vulnerable. Existing keeps things stable. Experiencing requires presence. Presence means you can't hide in the next task. You can't escape into the next goal. You have to sit in the now, and the now feels unfamiliar. Because when you sit still long enough, you start noticing something uncomfortable. You don't actually feel fulfilled. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, persistent way. You might call it boredom. You might call it restlessness. But underneath that restlessness is a deeper question. Is this it? That question isn't about ambition. It's about aliveness. You've checked the boxes. You've done what made sense. You followed the logical path. And logically, your life is complete. But emotionally, it feels unfinished. You don't feel like the main character. You feel like the manager, managing outcomes, managing expectations, managing your own reactions. But management is not immersion. You can manage a life without fully living it. And that realization can be unsettling. Because if nothing is obviously wrong, what exactly needs to change? You can't point to a single failure. You can't blame a single decision. It's not one big mistake. It's a gradual drift away from depth. You chose stability over risk, consistency over intensity, control over curiosity. And those choices weren't wrong. They were protective. But protection, when extended too long, can become confinement. You protected yourself from chaos. And in doing so, you reduced contrast. Without contrast, life feels flatter. Without vulnerability, joy feels muted. Without emotional risk, meaning feels theoretical. You read about the meaning of life. You think about purpose. But thinking about meaning is different from feeling it. Meaning isn't constructed only through achievement. It's felt through presence, through being inside your own experience without constantly evaluating it. But evaluation has become your default mode. You evaluate your productivity. You evaluate your progress. You evaluate your reactions. And constant evaluation creates distance. Distance between you and your own life. You don't hate your life. You just don't feel it deeply anymore. And that's harder to admit. Because dissatisfaction with chaos is easy to understand. Dissatisfaction with stability feels ungrateful. You tell yourself you should be content. Others would want what you have. So you minimize the feeling. You tell yourself it's a phase. But the longer you ignore it, the more it lingers. Because the problem isn't that your life is incomplete. The problem is that you're not fully inhabiting it. You built something solid. Now the question is quieter. Can you actually step inside it? Not as a manager, not as a planner, but as a participant. Because a life can look complete and still feel unlived. If a life can look complete and still feel unlived, then the question isn't, what am I missing? It's, where am I absent? That's a different kind of question. Missing implies lack. Absent implies distance. And distance is harder to admit, because distance suggests you were there once, and slowly, you stepped away. Not physically, internally. You stopped reacting fully, stopped engaging deeply, stopped letting moments interrupt you. You began moving through your life instead of into it. At first, it felt like growth. You were becoming calmer, more grounded, less reactive. And that was good. But there's a quiet threshold where calm becomes disengagement, where composure becomes detachment. And detachment, when it goes too far, begins to thin your experience. You don't get overwhelmed, but you also don't get moved. You don't feel dramatic lows, but you also don't feel vivid highs. Everything exists in a narrow emotional range, safe, manageable, predictable. Predictability feels comforting until it starts to feel repetitive. And repetition without presence creates emptiness. You wake up, you execute your routine, you accomplish what needs to be done. You look at your life and think, this should be enough. And maybe it is. But enough doesn't always mean alive. Aliveness requires risk, not reckless risk. Emotional risk. The risk of being surprised. The risk of feeling deeply. The risk of not controlling every outcome. Somewhere along the way, you optimized away risk. You chose certainty over curiosity, security over exploration. And those choices protected you. But they also limited contrast. Without contrast, meaning fades. Without uncertainty, growth slows. Without depth, time flattens. Days blur together. Weeks pass without imprint. You don't remember specific moments. You remember tasks. You remember milestones, but not textures, not the way something felt in your body, not the subtle emotional shift of a conversation. You've become outcome-focused, and outcome focus is efficient, but it's not immersive. Immersion requires surrender. Surrender requires presence. And presence requires that you stop scanning ahead. Stop calculating, stop evaluating, just for a moment. Be inside what is happening. But being inside the moment can feel uncomfortable, because when you're fully present, you can't hide behind performance. You can't distract yourself with the next objective. You have to feel. And feeling deeply means you might notice dissatisfaction. You might notice grief for paths not taken. You might notice that some parts of your life were built from obligation, not desire. That realization is heavy, because you can't blame anyone else. You made rational decisions. You chose wisely. You prioritized stability. But stability can quietly become a cage when it's never questioned. A life can be safe and still feel constricted. A life can be stable and still feel narrow. You might not want something entirely different. You might just want more texture, more spontaneity, more depth, more presence. But presence requires slowing down, and slowing down feels inefficient. You're used to momentum. You're used to progress. You measure your worth in movement. If you're not advancing, you feel stagnant. But constant advancement can create internal distance. You're always leaning forward, rarely settling into now. Now feels temporary. Now feels like a stepping stone. But what if now is the only place life actually happens? You've built your future carefully, but you've postponed your present repeatedly. I'll relax once this is done. I'll feel fulfilled when I reach that. I'll enjoy it more when things settle. But things rarely settle permanently. There's always another target, another improvement, another adjustment. And chasing perpetual improvement keeps you slightly outside your own experience. You're planning your life more than you're living it. Planning is safe. Living is uncertain. Living requires that you let go of control long enough to feel fully engaged. But engagement means vulnerability. If you engage deeply, you might care more. If you care more, you might risk disappointment. So you maintain a subtle buffer, not detached, just slightly removed, enough to function, not enough to feel everything. That buffer protected you, but it also muted you. Muted joy, muted curiosity, muted connection. You can still appreciate your life. But appreciation isn't the same as immersion. You can acknowledge that you're fortunate and still feel absent from your own moments. That's the paradox. You don't want to throw everything away. You just want to feel it more. You want your achievements to land with weight. You want your conversations to leave imprint. You want your days to feel distinct, not interchangeable. But distinct days require conscious presence. And conscious presence means tolerating whatever arises. Boredom, discomfort, longing. You've been managing discomfort for years. But maybe what you need isn't better management. Maybe it's deeper contact. Contact with your own internal world. Contact with the sensations of your life. Contact with what genuinely moves you, not just what makes sense. Because a life that makes sense is not automatically a life that feels lived. And the longer you postpone presence, the more your days start blending together. You don't need chaos. You need engagement. You don't need to dismantle everything. You need to step back into what's already there. Slow your pace enough to notice. Feel the weight of your own breath. Notice the tone of your own voice. Pay attention to the subtle signals in your body. Not to optimize them, just to experience them. Because completion isn't about external structure. It's about internal participation. You can have the right job, the right schedule, the right path, and still feel like you're hovering above it. Completion without immersion creates emptiness. Immersion without control creates aliveness. And aliveness isn't loud, it's textured, it's subtle, it's felt. You don't need more achievements. You need more contact with your own life while it's actually happening. There's a quiet realization that begins to surface. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly. You don't need a different life. You need to re-enter the one you already built. That realization can feel disorienting because it shifts the focus away from external change and toward internal presence. You've spent years improving the outside, career, habits, structure. Now the invitation is different. Can you sit inside your own moments without immediately evaluating them? Can you experience something without turning it into progress? That's unfamiliar territory. You're used to measuring. How productive was today? How efficient was that conversation? How close am I to the next milestone? But measurement creates distance. Distance creates detachment. And detachment creates that subtle feeling of being unlived. You don't feel empty because you lack achievements. You feel empty because you've been relating to your life like a project. A project can be optimized. A life must be inhabited. Inhabiting your life means slowing your internal commentary, noticing when you're rushing, noticing when you're scanning ahead, noticing when you're mentally elsewhere. It means asking a different question, not what's next, but what's here. That question feels small, but it's powerful, because what's here anchors you in the present. And presence is where meaning forms. Meaning doesn't arrive from future success. It emerges from attention, from allowing yourself to feel the texture of a conversation, from letting silence exist without filling it, from noticing your own reactions without editing them. You don't have to transform everything. You just have to stop postponing your own experience. Stop telling yourself you'll enjoy it later. Stop convincing yourself you'll feel fulfilled once it's finished. There is always something else to finish. There is always something else to improve. If you wait for completion to feel alive, you'll keep waiting. Because completion is an external condition. Aliveness is internal participation. And participation requires attention. Attention requires intention. You may notice resistance. Slowing down feels inefficient. Being present feels vulnerable. When you're fully present, you can't hide from subtle dissatisfaction. You can't distract yourself with the next goal. You feel the gap more clearly. But feeling the gap is the first step toward closing it. Because once you recognize where you've been absent, you can begin returning. Not through dramatic reinvention, through small shifts. Lingering in a moment a few seconds longer. Letting yourself feel joy without analyzing it. Admitting when something doesn't resonate, instead of forcing gratitude. You don't need to abandon stability. You need to bring depth into it. Stability with presence feels grounded. Stability without presence feels mechanical. You've mastered the mechanical side. Now the work is quieter. Relearning how to feel inside your own life. Not perfectly, not constantly, just honestly. Because a life that looks complete doesn't become lived through more structure. It becomes lived when you finally allow yourself to be fully inside it, instead of standing slightly outside. When you begin to step back inside your life, something subtle changes. Not the structure, not the responsibilities. You start noticing where you've been rushing, where you've been anticipating the next thing instead of inhabiting this one, where you've been completing moments instead of experiencing them. That awareness can feel uncomfortable at first because it reveals how often you've been elsewhere, physically present, mentally ahead, emotionally buffered. You may start catching yourself mid-routine, halfway through a conversation realizing you weren't actually listening, halfway through a task realizing you're already thinking about what's next, halfway through a successful day realizing you don't remember how it felt. That's not failure. That's awakening. And awakening isn't loud. It's repetitive. It's the repeated noticing, the repeated returning, the repeated choice to stay instead of drift. At first, staying feels inefficient. Your mind wants stimulation. Your nervous system wants momentum. But momentum without presence is what created the flatness in the first place. So you experiment with something different. You pause a second longer before responding. You let silence stretch slightly instead of filling it immediately. You allow yourself to fully register what your body is feeling, not to fix it, just to notice it. You might discover small textures you've been skipping over for years. The warmth in your chest when someone speaks sincerely. The subtle tightness in your shoulders when something doesn't feel aligned. The way your breath shifts when you feel calm. These details were always there. You just weren't inhabiting them. And slowly, as you pay attention, life begins to feel less mechanical. Not more dramatic, just more textured. You start noticing that meaning isn't created by scale. It's created by depth. A small conversation can feel meaningful if you're fully inside it. A quiet morning can feel grounding if you're not rushing past it. Presence doesn't add more to your life. It deepens what's already there. And that depth changes the experience of completion. Completion stops being about external milestones and starts becoming about internal alignment. You don't need to reinvent everything. You don't need to make impulsive decisions. You just need to stop living slightly outside your own moments. You may still have structure. You may still have ambition. But ambition doesn't have to erase presence. Structure doesn't have to eliminate spontaneity. Stability doesn't have to mean detachment. Those were unconscious trade-offs. Now you're renegotiating them. You're allowing yourself to feel again. Not intensely, just honestly. and honesty reconnects you to your own experience. You begin to realize something important. You weren't lacking something external. You were lacking internal contact. Contact with your reactions. Contact with your desires. Contact with the present moment. That contact brings subtle shifts. You laugh and actually feel it. You complete something and allow it to land. You sit quietly and don't immediately reach for distraction. These are small moments, but they accumulate. And accumulation works both ways. Years of slight absence created that unlived feeling. Now repeated presence begins reversing it. You won't feel completely transformed overnight, but you will feel slightly more inside your life, slightly more grounded, slightly more awake, and over time, slightly become substantial. Because a life doesn't feel lived through dramatic change. It feels lived through consistent presence, through choosing to be here, instead of always preparing for somewhere else. At some point, you stop asking, why doesn't this feel like enough? And you begin asking, how can I be more here? That shift changes everything, because it moves you from chasing to inhabiting. You don't need to dismantle your life. You don't need a dramatic escape. You need depth. Depth in the same routines. Depth in the same relationships. Depth in the same moments. You've spent years believing that fulfillment would arrive once everything was aligned externally. Once the job was right. Once the schedule was stable. Once the milestones were achieved. And maybe those things matter, but they don't guarantee presence. Presence is internal permission. Permission to slow down without guilt. Permission to feel without analyzing. Permission to experience without measuring. You begin noticing when you drift, when your mind jumps ahead, when you start evaluating instead of engaging. And instead of judging yourself, you gently return. Return to your breath. Return to the conversation. Return to the sensation in your body. That return is small, but it's powerful. Because every time you return, you're choosing to live instead of manage. Managing keeps things intact. Living makes them meaningful. You don't have to feel intense joy every day. You don't have to transform into someone spontaneous and reckless. Aliveness isn't loud. It's attentive. It's being fully in a moment long enough for it to imprint. You start noticing color again. The way light falls in the afternoon. The tone in someone's voice when they're sincere. The subtle shift in your mood when something resonates. These details were always there, but you were rushing past them. Now, you're staying inside your experience, staying long enough to feel it. And as you stay, your life begins to feel less like a checklist and more like a story. Not a dramatic story, a textured one with quiet scenes, subtle emotions, moments that don't look impressive but feel real. You begin to understand something deeper. Completion was never the goal. Connection was. Connection to yourself. Connection to your own reactions. Connection to the present moment. A life can look complete and still feel unlived when you're absent from it. But the moment you re-enter, even slightly, even imperfectly, it begins to soften. You stop searching for a different path. You start inhabiting this one. And inhabiting doesn't require perfection. It requires attention. It requires honesty. It requires allowing yourself to feel without constantly correcting yourself. You might still have ambition. You might still want growth. But growth becomes less frantic. Less about filling a void. More about expanding something you already feel connected to. The urgency fades. The quiet settles. You're no longer trying to escape your life. You're trying to enter it. And that's a different kind of movement. It's slower, more grounded, less visible from the outside, but deeply felt on the inside. You don't need more milestones to feel complete. You need more presence to feel alive. And presence isn't something you achieve once. It's something you practice. Every time you notice you've drifted. Every time you pause instead of rush. Every time you choose to experience instead of evaluate. A life that feels unlived is often a life lived on autopilot. A life that feels alive is one lived consciously, moment by moment. You don't need to replace what you built. You need to step fully into it. And when you do, even ordinary days begin to carry weight. Not because they changed, but because you did.